All right, team, welcome to Chapter 2. This is the first chapter of the textbook where we really start jumping into the substantive areas of sport and the law. So, this is probably going to be a shorter lecture and a shorter unit, and we are going to be talking about risk management and preventative law. And both of these are approaches for managers, whether it's in sport or business or other related areas, that is used to limit potential liability. So the textbook talks about both risk management and preventative law. And what is risk management, you ask me? Well, risk management is the process of looking to identify potential risks that may lead to liability for your organization. And this is often coming in the form of anything that bad happens. Someone falls on the field of play and breaks a bone. Someone commits a foul. Something happens that creates a legal risk. And that with that legal risk comes that liability, and then the organization has to pay money. And with risk management, the process is really focused on trying to identify potential bad things that could happen on the premise and that could cause financial injury. Now, preventative law is a little bit different. Preventative law widens the scope of the potential risk. So it doesn't just look at what bad things could happen from a legal perspective resulting in financial harm because of a adverse judgment through the process of litigation. Instead, here we're also looking at things like the environmental, political, reputational, cultural, institutional consequences. So it's much broader of a scope. So, on one hand, we look at just liability for risk management, but on the other hand, for preventative law, we're looking at the whole spectrum. So, I try to pull into class conversation current events that are ongoing. So right now, unless you have not been tuned into television or the web, you probably know about what has been going on with the Ryan Lochte saga. Ryan Lochte is a swimmer with USA Swimming representing the United States, and for the past 10 days or so, he's been embroiled in the scandal, dragging in his fellow swimmers as well as the United States and the internet and the U.S. Olympic Committee, where he had claimed that him and his mates were robbed by robbers who pretended to be police, and that he fabricated this big story. And I've got posted on the Blackboard webpage some links that link to video that really ferret out the evolution of this controversy. And we can look at the Lochte saga from both a risk management and preventative law standpoint. So I would ask you to take a look at those videos, because this would be an activity for you to do after you've gone through this unit and watch this PowerPoint, and try to understand what would be the approach that USA Swimming would take from a risk management standpoint versus a preventative law standpoint. And preventative law really is an approach that is tied to an organization's foundational values, what's important to that organization. So USA Swimming might look at what their mission statement is and what some of their foundational values, what's important, honesty, integrity, is to try to prevent athletes or personnel who relate to USA Swimming from getting into a position that could injure USA Swimming in some sort of way. But then also, when that unfortunately something bad happens, what are the sort of the risks that USA Swimming has to deal with? So if we're looking at the preventative law process, we're looking at five components here. You're looking at the legal audit, which would be identifying the different risks. Remember, it's not just risk from a legal perspective, but also from the whole gambit, the whole spectrum: environment, reputation, it could be a much larger array. And then once you've actually identified those risks and cross-reference those with your foundational core values, you would assess that risk from its in terms of its frequency and its severity. And then you'd evaluate the risk in terms of how to deal with that. And then after that, you would be designing your preventative law plan and finally implementing your preventative law plan. So, for example, in terms of the risk audit, the textbook gives an example of a health club who is trying to identify and create a policy that deals with various risks through the risk audit. So here we've got employment issues, we've got premise liability, facility issues, client concerns, intellectual property. So all of these are from a legal and business standpoint, but they certainly have consequences beyond legal and business. So for example, in terms of client or participant concerns, if something negative happens within this health club, they have a bad experience. It might not end up being something where the organization faces a financial loss due to a lawsuit, but perhaps the client or participant goes on YouTube or Twitter or Snapchat, you name the social media, and starts disparaging the health club because of their negative experience. That has a cost to their reputation. So that it might not be a legal consequence, but it has a different consequence. And you could pick out many of these different issues that are laid out in here and do a similar analysis. Now, from a legal perspective, in terms of liability, and liability is legal responsibility, potential identifications could be from tort law, contract law, employment law, administrative law, intellectual property law. And these are all things that we'll talk about throughout the course once we really get into the meat of the course. But to kind of provide some context here, I want to play a video here that took place about 6 months ago from our neighbors up the street in Houston. And to set the stage, the University of Houston is in the American Athletic Conference, and they are one of the rumored schools that will be applying for membership in the Big 12 Conference. And last year, they made the news for what happened on the field, but it had nothing to do with the actual play on the field in terms of the athletes, but instead the fans wanting to rush the field to celebrate a victory. And I will play the video of what happened, and I want you to think about how the university, when it is trying to design their risk audit, what might be going through their heads, in their collective heads, in terms of the athletic department and other strategic partners when thinking about dealing with crowd control issues. So it'll be easy to just play the video here, and then we will come back and discuss ever so briefly. It's a very short video. But again, Houston had just won, and the fans wanted to rush the field. And so this was from a camera that took some video after the win. So right off the bat, I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. One, these people in the yellow jackets are CSC event staff, and they most undoubtedly are an external party, an independent contractor that contracted with the University of Houston and the athletic department to be their on-field security. And by being independent contractors, that means that, in theory, the University of Houston could avoid liability for any sort of incident that occurs with fans. But if you looked at this video, you could see some of the CSC staff are standing around, Some are running to and fro. This gentleman on the left was just checking his cell phone. Maybe he was tweeting. So there's not exactly everyone is not on the same page. So maybe that is an issue right off the bat. But let's continue. So we got this guy being tackled. Other people are running away. Guy is like gets away. What's happening? People getting tackled, some people are going. And here's the equipment from ESPN that might need to be secured. But all in all, we really don't know what's going on here. What's the strategy? What's the plan? That guy had a beer, I think, a tall boy. In any case, you get the gist of it. So from looking at that, there are different risks that could arise, both from a traditional legal standpoint in terms of tort law or contract law. So a tort is a civil wrong where someone commits an unwanted act against another person. So that person being tackled by the CSC security could potentially sue CSC for assault and battery or excessive force. But there's different potential risks. Or going back to the preventive law standpoint, when that video makes the rounds, if it's on the news, the University of Houston and CSC could suffer injury from a political, a cultural, an institutional standpoint, even if no one sues, even if no one is hurt. But the risk of people rushing the field or having some sort of crowd control issue in general, if we kind of broaden this out to sport management or athletics, is very real. So this sort of issue should be something that's addressed from a preventative law standpoint, and it would be ferreted out from a risk audit. So once that risk audit occurs and the danger of people rushing the field is noted in that, then the risk assessment would occur. And you're looking at what sort of injury could occur in terms of the severity. Is it something that's very mild injury? Someone maybe twists their ankle, or someone is embarrassed, or is it something more catastrophic? Let's say that person jumps from the ledge down to the field and they seriously hurt, they break their neck somehow, or a person being tackled is crushed, or when goalposts are torn down, if someone gets hit by the goalpost on the way down. So we look at the severity and the frequency of that risk, and we look at the history of these potential issues as a barometer to try to assess the frequency. And the institution, in this case the University of Houston, should set priorities of how to deal with this as a risk based on what their guiding fundamental foundational values are as an organization. So here are a couple of different examples from premise liability, and that premise liability is sort of the risk of harm to someone who's coming into your facility. We've got, for example, bleachers missing some slates, which could cause a slip and fall injury. The frequency of risk is occasional, and the magnitude of the risk is moderate here. And then within the column on the right, there would be a suggestion on how to handle that risk. But here's some examples. So the question becomes, what type of risks arise from rushing the field, and what are the frequency of those risks and the magnitude, and how would you handle that? So that's really comes into play under risk evaluation. You look at, again, you evaluate the risks in concert with what is important to the organization, their mission. and then you work to try to develop strategies to minimize the risk. So what might be a potential strategy for minimizing risk? Maybe Houston, working with CSC, says, well, let's actually let them on the field so they don't hurt themselves, and we don't hurt them by tackling them, but we concentrate the people in the yellow shirts around expensive equipment and around the goalposts so that those goalposts cannot be taken down. Or maybe you get the goalposts that automatically can be taken down with proper equipment. Or who knows, there could be a litany of potential ways to deal with that. I'd be curious to hear if you wanted to post about that, how you might want to deal with that. Excuse me. You could also eliminate activities that are too risky. So here, under developing the plan, there are different types of ways to treat a risk. You could eliminate it, meaning that you just get rid of that risk. Let's say that this is an extreme, but we're worried about people rushing the field, so we cancel football. We don't have a football team. Or a more reasonable sort of example, there was a movement in the 1990s to take trampolines out of school gyms, high school gyms, middle school gyms, because the danger that they posed by people hurting themselves and the financial risk outweighed the benefit of having a trampoline there. So the school boards and superintendents just said, we're going to get rid of trampolines. Risk retention means that we'll retain the risk because the magnitude of the risk is outweighed by the benefit of whatever activity. That's usually things where risks are slight. So let's say that you offer a physical education class in middle school or in high school, and there's a risk that someone could twist their ankle in gym class. But that risk you're willing to take because of the benefits of having PE in school. Risk transfer would be something where you're trying to take the risk away from the organization and transfer it to another party. So, for example, you could transfer risk by an organization having insurance, so that an organization might pay a premium to the insurance company, and upon the stated occurrence of that sort of act that they're insured for, the organization would be covered because the insurance company would pay that person who was injured or cover the liability. Or we go back to the picture of Houston. The people in the yellow shirts I said were independent contractors. So they are the ones that actually come in and perform the activity that Houston as an institution might have liability for if something bad happened, but instead through an independent contractor, through the act of the contract, the contractual relationship between the two parties, any liability for that Houston might incur is actually transferred to CSC because they're the ones that were contracted out to handle the security, and therefore the risk of harm or the risk of liability transfers to them. Risk control would be that you might maintain that activity but implement small protocols, training protocols to lessen liabilities. So maybe CSC implements, not even CSC, let's say the organization updates their training or certifications to try to limit the potential risk of harm. But once you go through your risk assessment that was a result of your audit, and then evaluate the risk, and then develop your preventative plan, you can implement that preventative plan. And again, it's according to what the core values of that organization is. And it needs to be part of a management tool, and it needs to be updated. People need to be trained. And again, all of this is pursuant to what is in the best interests of the organization and trying to gain a competitive advantage in the marketplace, in the workplace, so that liability is limited and that organization can be more successful. So we've got the elements of your preventative law plan right here. So you can take a look at this little diagram. You've got your policies and procedures, then your contracts, that might be part of that, part of the preventive law plan, and training, and then the evaluation. So all works together. The contracts work as a risk shifting device. Training helps to lessen liability by controlling the risk, and the evaluation helps to make the policies better. So we've got some competitive strategies that you can take a look at on your own here. So you can feel free to pause this and take a look. But again, this is all part of trying to use the preventive law plan as part of the preventive law process, very holistic, to gain a competitive advantage and make sure that you work with reducing your risk. But if it's something where the organization is engaging in an activity that's part of and parcel, that's central to the organization, it might not be necessary to completely eliminate that activity if you can reduce the risk and act in a way that hopefully takes advantage of transferring risk to outside parties through insurance and independent contractors. And we'll talk about that later, both in part 2 and part 3 of this course. And we've got a few more here, making sure that all of your employees understand the plan both from a developmental and implementation standpoint, and that sufficient resources and time is used to develop the plan. So when I worked for the Arizona Coyotes, one of my jobs was to chair the risk management plan, and we used a way that was similar to preventive law, and I worked to get many stakeholders from all areas of the organization involved with being a part of that committee to create that plan, because if the more stakeholders you have, the more effective the plan can be and comprehensive. So frequently updating the plan, effective use of contracts, effective use of feedback, and also other mechanisms through training will help to develop a very effective preventative law plan that will make your organization more competitive and make you as an employee a better employee. And again, these plans should reflect the organization's values. So with that being said, I want to redirect your attention back to the Ryan Lochte saga. Think about the preventive law structure and preventive law plan. Take a look at the links I sent, watch the videos, and think about if you were the USOC, the United States Olympic Committee, or USA Swimming, what sort of elements would go into making your preventive law plan? What sort of guiding principles would guide how you interact with employees, who you use to help go through the risk audit, evaluation, and implementation of your preventive law plan? And we can continue the conversation on the Classroom Cafe and in the discussion boards. So with that, hopefully you enjoyed this second lecture, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.